The first time the household spoke of it, it was with that low, voiced incredulity which clings to the edges of a nightmare. Something too preposterous to believe, and yet too solid to ignore. Lady Halberton had been found lifeless in her own gallery. The long polished corridor, lined with ancestral portraits, a place so private that even her servants entered only at specific summons. The windows were barred. Original ironwork, impossible to tamper with without drawing notice, and the gallery doors locked from the inside. The housemaids had discovered her body after she failed to descend for dinner, and the butler, when he forced the door with a skeleton key, declared in horrified tones that he had left her alive and well scarcely an hour before. Her death, though, was not what rendered the scene unendurable. It was the one odd, inexplicable detail, the prints of damp shoes stretching the length of the hallway. Small, narrow shoes, as though belonging to a child. Yet the house contained no children. The maid who had found her swore that Lady Halberton's own slippers were still neatly upon her feet, pale silk embroidered with ivy leaves, untouched by dampness. And no one could explain why such prints should have appeared in a locked chamber, where no outsider could possibly have entered. Inspector Arbuthnot of the local constabulary made the first, fumbling attempt at order. He stood amid the curious household, footmen craning their necks, the cook dabbing her eyes with her apron, and proclaimed it was surely the work of some intruder who had found a hidden way in. Yet he looked in vain for open windows, for secret panels, for any signs of forced entry. The iron bars mocked him. The dust along the skirting boards lay smooth and unbroken, and every key to the gallery was accounted for one in the butler's possession. One upon Lady Halberton's ring, and the third sealed in a tin box at the estate's solicitor's office in town. The prints themselves defied analysis. They were not muddy, as though made by soil dragged in from outside, but damp, as if stamped by soles that had walked through shallow water. Each one shone faintly on the polished floor, darker patches against the gleam of wax. They trailed from one end of the corridor to the other. And then, just where Lady Halberton's body lay slumped against the panelling, they ceased abruptly. There was no turning back, no smudge of retreat, no fading as though the walker had dried his shoes. Only silence, and then death. By morning word had spread beyond the estate walls. Neighbors whispered of haunting, of some ghostly child prowling the house that night. A groom declared he had seen a flicker of movement in the gallery window shortly before dusk, though how that could be, when Lady Halberton had locked herself in, no one could fathom. Arbuthnot, worn down by theories and the steady pressure of servants demanding explanations, wrote his report with a heavy hand. Subject deceased, cause indeterminate, probable natural seizure. Unusual marks upon flooring. Explanation uncertain. But there was one man to whom such untidiness was intolerable. Lord Peter Wimsey arrived 3 days later, invited not by the authorities, but by a distant cousin of Lady Halberton, who could not reconcile herself to so grotesque and inconclusive an end. Wimsey was welcomed with relief by the household, though with a touch of unease his manner. Polite, bantering, with eyes that missed nothing, seemed ill-suited to grief. He strolled through the house as though he had always belonged, pausing before a portrait of a frowning ancestor, or commenting lightly on the silverwork displayed in the dining room. Only when he entered the gallery did the whimsical air falter, and his head tilt in sharp attention. Lady Halberton's body had been removed by then, but the prints remained, preserved in chalk outlines where the inspector had traced them. Wimsey crouched, running a white, gloved finger lightly across the surface of the boards. He sniffed it, frowned, and said nothing. His gaze followed the trail, step by step, until it halted in mid-passage like a broken sentence. Then, with a sudden flourish, he wheeled round, scanning the pictures on the walls, the gaps between their frames, the height of the wainscoting. "Curious," he murmured. "Very curious indeed. A footstep without a walker, a trail without a source, and a death without a cause." The butler, who had hovered in anxious attendance, protested in weary tones that Lady Halberton had been in the best of health, save for a tendency to migraines. Wimsey inclined his head, but asked instead for the exact times of every movement in the house that evenings, who had been in the kitchen, who in the stables, who had last seen her ladyship. Arbuthnot's notes were dragged out and cross-examined, revealing nothing but a monotonous normality. Dinner was at 7. Lady Halberton had retired to the gallery at 6:30. No one else had entered. And yet Wimsey pressed. Had anyone heard sounds? A door shutting, a voice, a tread. At this the maid faltered, then confessed in a whisper that she had thought. Just as dusk was falling, she had heard a soft laugh from the gallery. A child's laugh, high-pitched and fleeting. She had dismissed it at once, for what child could possibly be there? This detail, whispered like a guilty secret, altered the shape of the riddle. Wimsey walked once more the length of the corridor, measuring each step of the phantom shoes, until he came to their abrupt conclusion by the panel where Lady Halberton had fallen. He touched the wood, tapped it, pressed his ear to it. The panel rang hollow, yet when Arbuthnot had sought for hidden doors, he had found none. Wimsey smiled, a thin, secretive smile. That evening, when the servants had withdrawn, he returned with a lantern, and in the solitude of the hall he performed a small, deliberate experiment. A basin of water stood at his feet. He dipped a pair of shoes into it, let them soak, then pressed them upon the polished boards. The prints gleamed dark, precisely like those left behind by the mysterious visitor. But when he waited, they began slowly to fade, evaporating into nothingness. Lady Halberton's prints had not faded. After 3 days, they still remained. This, he whispered to himself, is no accident, nor the idle footprint of a wandering ghost. It is a message, deliberate, contrived. And the hand that leaves so careful a message is the hand that kills. Thus the crime stood: locked doors, barred windows, a trail of footprints that could not have existed, and a woman dead without a mark upon her. It was too simple to be explained by any ordinary means, and too complex to be passed off as natural. A paradox in the form of a hallway. The household waited, whispering of hauntings. The constable grumbled of tricks and conspiracies. And Wimsey, walking that corridor alone in the midnight hush, let the puzzle grow in his mind like a shadow. The answer was there, hidden in plain sight, within the silence of those strange, deliberate steps. Lord Peter Wimsey was not a man to leap upon conclusions. His eye, bright and restless, roved like a bird of prey, marking the smallest trifles with equal care as the grand impossibilities. On the morning after his quiet experiment with the basin of water, he made his way down to the gallery again, this time with Arbuthnot in tow. The inspector had little relish for his company, preferring the blunt comfort of official routine, yet could not entirely resist the pull of Wimsey's calm assurance. Prints made by wet shoes. Wimsey said lightly, tracing the chalk outlines with the tip of his cane, ought not to last more than a few hours, certainly not for days. Yet here they are, as fresh as the moment they were discovered. Your men have tested them. Arbuthnot muttered something about lampblack powder and the absence of dust. Wimsey chuckled softly. Exactly. They are not prints at all in the natural sense, but a composition, something painted or stamped, perhaps with oil or glycerin to preserve the appearance. An illusion, sir? and illusions do not present themselves without an author. The remark irritated the inspector, who had no taste for theories that shifted the crime from accident to artifice. He growled that there was no proof of foul play. The lady had been elderly. She might have suffered a stroke. But Wimsey's gaze had already drifted to a darker corner of the hall, where the portraits loomed under shadow. He stooped suddenly, his monocle glinting in the shaft of morning light, and retrieved something so slight it might have escaped every other eye. It was a thread, thin, black, no longer than an inch, caught upon the rough edge of the panelling near where Lady Halberton had collapsed. He turned it between finger and thumb, considering it with a small satisfied hum. Arbuthnot dismissed it at once as lint or cobweb, but Wimsey pocketed it without comment. Later, when the household assembled for questioning, Wimsey's gaze grew keener still. He spoke to them kindly, as though their grief were his own, but behind his affable words he watched, noted, weighed. The butler, stolid and precise, recounted his timetable with clockwork certainty. The cook, tearful, clutched her apron as though it were a shield. The maid who had confessed to hearing laughter trembled as she repeated her story, insisting again that it had been the laugh of a child. Wimsey's voice softened as he pressed her. Had she seen anything, even a flicker, in the gallery window? She swore she had not, though her eyes slid nervously toward the housekeeper, who frowned her into silence. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Henslow, who struck Wimsey as oddly misaligned with the rest. She was brisk, unsentimental, her answers given with an almost professional clarity. Yet she alone seemed impatient to have the matter concluded. When he inquired after the keys, it was she who volunteered at once that the butler held one, Lady Halberton another, and the solicitor the third. Wimsey's gaze sharpened at the detail she added, and her ladyship never permitted her keys to leave her sight. The remark, so emphatically offered, caught his ear. He bowed slightly as though satisfied, but in his mind it took on a darker hue. He asked, in his blandest tones, whether Lady Halberton had any peculiar habits, any anxieties about intruders. The housekeeper hesitated a fraction too long, then answered that her ladyship had disliked strangers in the house. A reasonable answer, but Wimsey had learned to treasure hesitation. When at last the group dispersed, he lingered behind. His eye fell upon the nearest portrait, a sombre ancestor in ruff and lace. The frame's lower edge bore a faint smear, as though touched by damp fingers. He raised his cane to the mark, then bent closer. It was not damp at all, but a streak of some viscous substance. Varnish, perhaps, or something with an oily sheen. He tested it with a pocket knife, and found it tacky still. Someone had handled the frame, and recently. That evening he asked Arbuthnot to walk the corridor with him once more. "Tell me, Inspector," he said, almost idly, "why do you suppose the prints ceased precisely where they did? Not before, not beyond, but at that very panel." Arbuthnot grumbled that he had already beaten the panel with his fists and found it solid. Wimsey smiled thinly. "Solid, yes. But what if its solidity is itself a disguise? You saw no hinge, no crack. Yet I have found traces of varnish applied where none should be. Paint conceals more than woodworm, my dear fellow." The inspector refused to be drawn, but Wimsey was content to wait. He had other questions to pursue. He dined with the family that evening, speaking charmingly of books, music, and town gossip, all the while observing their faces in the candlelight. The cousin who had summoned him was pale with distress. The younger footman who poured the wine was clumsy with nerves. But Mrs. Henslow, at the far end of the table, never once allowed her expression to alter. She cut her meat with neat precision, her eyes lowered, her manner almost defiant in its composure. It was she who later led him to the late lady's chamber, offering to show him her belongings. The room was orderly, its writing desk closed, its jewels in their box, its keys upon the nightstand. Whimsy's hand lingered over the ring of keys. "You are quite sure, Mrs. Henslow, that no one else ever had use of these?" he asked. "Quite sure, my lord," she answered, with a crispness that might have sounded convincing, had he not caught the smallest flicker of unease in her eyes when he lifted the key that matched the gallery door. He replaced it gently, thanked her, and bowed out. Yet as he turned away, he caught sight of something that had been tucked behind the curtain near the window, a child's toy, a wooden spinning top, crudely painted in bright colors. He paused. "Odd," he murmured. "Did Lady Halberton entertain young visitors?" Mrs. Henslow's eyes narrowed. "Not that I recall. The object must belong to some servant." But Whimsy, smiling politely, slipped the toy into his pocket when she was not looking. He turned it over later in his own chamber, noting the faint smear of the same oily substance clinging to its base as he had found upon the portrait frame. He leaned back in his chair, his face shadowed by the lamp. A child's laughter, a child's toy, but no child, he mused softly. And prints that remain, when natural prints should fade. A conjurer's trick, perhaps, or a deception played with exquisite care. The question is, who profits from such artifice? The thread, the varnish, the toy, the nervous hesitation, all gathered into his mind, not yet forming a picture, but like tesserae waiting for their mosaic. Somewhere in the house lay the hidden passage of truth, as cunningly disguised as the panel in the gallery wall. And Whimsy, with his keen eye and patient hand, meant to uncover it. The next day broke grey and low, clouds pressing heavy upon the chimneys of Halberton Hall. Whimsy, rising earlier than his custom, contrived to gather the household one by one, not in a formal sitting, but by casual summons. So casual, indeed, that few realized they were under examination until their own words had already betrayed them. He had learnt that truth seldom emerged in orderly cues. It leaked, in fragments, when people felt least prepared. The butler came first, summoned on the pretext of breakfast arrangements. Whimsy praised the coffee, inquired about vintages of port, then suddenly asked, "Tell me, Dobson, when you fetched the key that night, were you quite alone?" The man stiffened, his hands folded behind his back. Yes, quite alone. He had gone to the pantry, taken the skeleton key, and met the maid at the gallery door. But Whimsy pressed a little harder, and out tumbled a hesitation. The solicitor's key, the one sealed in tin, had been mentioned among the staff the day before the death. Someone had remarked that 3 keys existed, not 2. Who had said it? Dobson could not recall. But Whimsy saw the color rise on the man's neck, as though he regretted letting the detail slip. The cook followed, still tearful, her apron corners damp. She spoke of Lady Halberton with affection, insisting her ladyship had been in spirits the day she died, even asking after the orchard apples. Did she complain of pain, shortness of breath? Whimsy asked. Never, came the answer, firm and immediate. Yet later, when questioned again, she admitted Lady Halberton had grown withdrawn of late, often taking her meals in the gallery. "To be quiet," she whispered, away from the noise. Whimsy noted the contradiction without remarking on it. The maid, the one who had heard the laugh, proved trickier. She wrung her hands and darted her eyes about the library, where Whimsy had her seated. "It was a laugh, sir, I swear it," she murmured, like a little boy's laugh. "But when I told Mrs. Henslow, she said I must never repeat it. Said it was my fancy." Whimsy leaned forward, gently. "Do you often imagine things?" Her chin lifted at that, defiance flashing through her fear. "No, my lord. I know what I heard." That spark of indignation struck Whimsy as genuine. Yet why had the housekeeper sought to hush her? When at last Mrs. Henslow herself entered, it was with the air of one determined not to be caught unawares. Her back was rigid, her dress impeccable, her eyes cool. She spoke readily of Lady Halberton's health, of her dislike of callers, of the orderliness of her routine. She locked herself in the gallery each evening. Yes, Mrs. Henslow declared, but it was habit, not fear. Her ladyship liked her solitude. Whimsy let her speak, watching her lips form each precise word, then inquired, ever so lightly, whether she had entered the lady's room the night before. "Naturally," she replied. "I always brought up her cocoa." He turned a little then, studying the window, as if the question were an afterthought. "Hey, and where was the toy, the spinning top?" The pause, though no longer than a heartbeat, was enough. She composed herself quickly, saying it must have been left by a visiting tradesman's child, perhaps during some delivery. Whimsy merely inclined his head, but inside his mind the note rang sharp. She lied. Later in the stable yard, Whimsy sought the grooms. One of them, a sharp-eyed fellow named Costa, volunteered that he had seen lights flicker in the gallery at dusk. The sort of flicker one makes by shading a lamp with the hand. He was chided by another groom, who muttered that imagination was running wild. Whimsy asked nothing further, but tucked away the opposition as keenly as the story itself. By afternoon, Arbuthnot grew impatient with this parade of whispers and fragments. "It's nothing but gossip, Whimsy. Contradictions, lapses of memory, will get nowhere at this pace." But Whimsy shook his head. "On the contrary, Inspector, the contradictions are the very stuff of truth. When witnesses all agree too neatly, you may be sure they are repeating a tale. When their stories crack, you glimpse what lies beneath." That evening he called upon Lady Halberton's cousin, Mrs. Vernon, whose pale features had until then escaped notice in the bustle. She received him in her sitting-room, clutching her embroidery as though it were armor. At first she answered dutifully, but then, perhaps grateful for his gentleness, she confessed something curious. Lady Halberton, she said, had become uneasy in her final weeks, locking away papers, dismissing callers abruptly, even snapping at Mrs. Vernon herself for lingering near the gallery. She said the family portrait spoke to her at night. The cousin whispered, "I thought it was only her nerves." Whimsy thanked her, yet his mind ticked rapidly. Portraits that spoke, laughter with no child, prince with no walker. All hints of a deception meant to mimic the supernatural. The question was for whose benefit? To terrify Lady Halberton into something, or to cover a crime after it had been done. The pieces did not yet lock, but they jostled nearer. He sat alone in the study, drawing lines across a scrap of paper. Keys, prints, toys, laughter, while the house breathed uneasily around him. Someone within these walls had shaped a story too elaborate for chance. And each voice, in its eagerness or in its restraint, betrayed more than words. Mrs. Henslow had hurried to close the maid's mouth. Dobson had stumbled upon talk of keys that should have been sealed. The cook had contradicted herself. The cousin had confessed to fears only now admitted. Even the groom's chatter pointed to a light used where no hand should be. Whimsy tapped his pen against the toy top, now resting on the desk. The oily smear still clung to its base. He thought of the varnish on the portrait, of the thread caught in the panel. A stage had been set, and the actors were already speaking their lines. Only, as in all plays, some were over-rehearsed and some stumbled at the truth. "Voices of deception," he murmured. "One must learn which tone conceals and which betrays." And with that, he resolved to listen harder still, for the lie that would undo them. The house seemed to tighten around itself in those days after the death, every corridor whispering, every servant glancing sidelong at another. Whimsy moved through it as one might trace a maze, following each thread of motive to its tangled heart. He had heard their voices, noted their hesitations, now he must weigh their reasons, for murder is rarely born of accident. It springs from gain, from fear, from hatred, from love-twisted ori. The butler Dobson came first in his reckoning. Years of loyal service, stiff as starch, his life tethered to Lady Halberton's household. What reason would he have to harm her? Whimsy turned it over. Money? Unlikely. Dobson's wages were steady. And she had not the reputation of a mistress who would disinherit her servants without cause. Yet Whimsy remembered the slip, the mention of the solicitor's key. How had Dobson known of that? Idle chatter, perhaps, but in such a household, gossip had weight. Still, no clear profit for Dobson emerged. The cook, poor soul, seemed without guile, yet her contradiction nagged at him. Lady Halberton in good spirits, yet also withdrawn, ill at ease. Which was true? Perhaps both. Perhaps the cook lied to shield her mistress's growing frailty, fearing dismissal if word spread. Fear, then, not of murder, but of exposure. Whimsy crossed her off his mental list for now. The maid with the tale of laughter was more troublesome. She was young, unsteady, but her indignation had rung true. It was not she who invented deception, but one who wished her silence. Mrs. Henslow had silenced her. And there lay a motive already glimpsed the housekeeper's determination to control the story, to press every detail into neat lines. Was it simple instinct to maintain order, or something darker? He considered Mrs. Henslow with the keenest care. Long years in the household. Trusted by Lady Halberton, trusted by all. Too trusted, perhaps. Whimsy had seen her unease when the toy was mentioned, her too smooth account of the keys. But what did she stand to gain? Power, certainly with Lady Halberton gone, her authority over the servants grew. But power alone did not explain such elaborate trickery. The footprints, the staged haunting. No, her motive must lie deeper. Mrs. Vernon, the cousin, bore her own shadows. A dependent relation, her life supported by Lady Halberton's bounty. What if she feared being written out of a will? What if the old lady had threatened to cut her off? Yet Whimsy, watching her trembling hands clutch the embroidery, sensed more fear than malice. And yet fear itself could be motive enough. Fear of ruin, of poverty, of being turned adrift. The grooms offered another angle. Young Coster had seen the flicker of light, but his fellow stifled him. Were they covering each other's tracks? Whimsy asked himself whether the stables might hide a secret entry, a passage to the gallery. He filed it away. But the greatest knot was this. The elaborate staging of the crime could not be the act of one who simply wanted death. A simple push, a quiet poison, a smothering pillow, any of these would have sufficed. But this crime spoke of theatre. The prints, the laughter, the toy, all calculated to unnerve, to suggest something beyond natural law. Why? To frighten Lady Halberton before killing her, or to frighten others after she was gone? Whimsy walked the gallery again, alone, his cane tapping against the boards. He thought of Lady Halberton's own words, reported by Mrs. Vernon, that the portrait spoke to her. Was she being made to believe in ghosts? Driven into terror, her mind shaken until death seemed natural. It was possible. And if so, then the crime was more than killing. It was slow torture, carefully staged. That required both opportunity and intent. He returned to the key once more, 3 keys. Lady Halberton's upon her ring, untouched. The solicitor's sealed away. Only Dobson's skeleton key had opened that door. Yet Whimsy suspected another means. Perhaps the hidden panel he had half guessed. the varnished frame concealing some latch? If so, the question was who knew of it. And that knowledge, he suspected, was confined to someone who had tended the house for years. The motives thickened like fog. Mrs. Vernon's fear of disinheritance, Dobson's secret knowledge, perhaps loyalty bent, the cook fearful but harmless, the maid witness to something forbidden, the grooms complicit or silenced, and Mrs. Henslow, cool, commanding, with her lies smoothed as neatly as linen. Yet none of these alone explained the toy. Whimsy turned it again in his fingers, feeling the oily smear. The substance, he suspected, was the same that had marked the portrait frame and preserved the false prints. A material not commonly at hand in kitchens or stables, but more likely among the household supplies for polishing and maintenance. Whose duty was it to keep such things? The housekeeper's. He smiled thinly in the darkened hall. Yes, the maze was tightening. Each passage bent back toward Mrs. Henslow, yet even so, he hesitated. Motive was not yet clear. Did she act for herself or on behalf of another? Was she protecting Mrs. Vernon, shielding a relative, or seeking her own inheritance? That night, Whimsy retired late, but not to sleep. He sat at his desk. The toy before him, the black thread beside it, his notes sprawling like a chessboard of names and arrows. He thought of Lady Halberton alone in her gallery. Portrait staring down, hearing laughter in the dark. He thought of her fear, her sudden collapse. And he thought of the hand that had arranged the stage, painted the prints, set the toy, silenced the maid. It was a hand accustomed to service, to invisibility, to ordering the house as one pleased. A hand that knew which key lay where, which panel rang hollow, which servant could be hushed. The maze was not yet solved, but the paths were narrowing. Soon, one would find oneself at the center, and Whimsy, with his quiet patience, meant to be there first. The morning after Whimsy had drawn his private maps of motive and deceit, the house was thrown into sudden commotion. A discovery had been made, and Arbuthnot, red, faced with triumph, summoned all to hear it. The butler Dobson, searching through a cupboard at the back of the scullery, had come upon a small tin box wedged behind cleaning supplies. Within it lay a pair of shoes, small, narrow, damp, stained at the soles. Shoes that could have made the prints in the gallery. Arbuthnot brandished them with satisfaction. There's your ghost, Whimsy. No phantoms at all, just trickery. Whoever hid these is your killer, and mark my words, we'll soon know which servant they belong to. The household buzzed with nervous whispers, some craning to see, others shrinking back. Mrs. Henslow stepped forward at once, her voice sharp and certain. Those are not from my storeroom. None of my staff wear shoes of that size. Her denial was swift, almost rehearsed. Dobson, under pressure, admitted he had never seen them before either. But Arbuthnot, already flushed with the thrill of a solution, declared that the matter was plain. Some servant had donned the shoes, soaked them, and staged the prints to make a murder appear supernatural. Lady Halberton, startled by such devilry, had collapsed and died of shock. No further malice was needed. The servants, half terrified, half relieved, seized upon this theory with eagerness. A trick, yes, but not a murder. A prank gone wrong. If that were true, then none of them bore blood on their hands. The cook crossed herself, whispering thanks. The maid sobbed in guilty relief. Only Whimsy, standing apart with his monocle dangling, looked unconvinced. He took the shoes from Arbuthnot's hand, weighing them lightly. The leather was cheap, ill-made, scarcely the kind a servant of Halberton Hall would wear even in leisure. He touched the soles with his fingertip, then raised it to his nose. There it was again. The faint oily tang he had already smelt on the toy, on the portrait frame, on the preserved prints themselves. Interesting, he murmured. That the same hand which staged the footprints should also conceal the instrument of its art in so careless a fashion. Arbuthnot bristled. Careless. It was cunning enough to fool your clever notions until Dobson stumbled on it. Whimsy smiled thinly. Oh, but consider. Inspector, why hide the shoes in so obvious a place? A cupboard behind the scullery where any servant might go. Why not burn them, bury them, cast them in the river? Unless, of course, one wanted them to be found. This suggestion chilled the room at once. Mrs. Vernon gasped softly, her embroidery trembling in her lap. Mrs. Henslow's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Arbuthnot, however, would not be swayed. A prank that killed by accident is crime enough. I'll have a name by evening. He began questioning each servant with brusque authority, demanding who had handled the cupboard last, who had entered the scullery that morning. Each denied it, voices rising, fear quickening. By dusk he had fixed his suspicion on the young maid, the one who had spoken of laughter. She trembled under the weight of his questions, stammering that she had never seen the shoes before. Yet the size matched her small feet. The cupboard was one she often used. Arbuthnot declared it sufficient. She was taken aside, half fainting, and the inspector pronounced the matter virtually closed. The household breathed easier. A culprit, a reason. A case nearly solved. Only Whimsy sat silent, watching the maid's pale face and the quick flicker of Mrs. Henslow's eyes. He saw in that flicker not relief, but calculation. That night, in the dimness of his chamber, Whimsy laid the shoes beside the toy top and the black thread. He stared at them long, his face drawn. Too neat, he whispered. Far too neat. Shoes planted to be found. A girl accused who lacks wit enough to devise such artifice. The true hand remains hidden. And now, shielded by Arbuthnot's triumph, it may strike again. He slept little. At intervals he walked the corridor of the gallery, his lantern throwing long, slanting shadows across the portraits. He thought of Lady Halberton's last moments, alone in this silent place. The laughter, the prince, the toy, all part of a drama contrived for her terror. And now, another drama unfolding, a false victory for the authorities, a scapegoat delivered, while the architect of the crime remained cloaked. In the kitchen below, the servants whispered of dismissal, of gall, of disgrace. The maid lay weeping, protesting her innocence, but her cries only hardened Arbuthnot's conviction. Whimsy, listening, knew the danger. Once the inspector sealed the case, the real criminal could move freely again, assured of impunity. And what was to prevent a second act? Another death? Cloaked in shadow, while the world believed the story already ended. He leaned against the cold paneling of the gallery, fingers tracing the hollow-sounding wood. Somewhere behind it, he was certain, lay the passage of truth. But truth still eluded him, as slippery as the oily sheen upon the toy. Still, one certainty remained: the game was not yet done. And while Arbuthnot toasted his own victory, Whimsy felt the unseen hand preparing its next move. The days that followed the discovery of the shoes weighed heavily on Halberton Hall. Inspector Arbuthnot moved with the complacency of a man who believed his work complete, his reports drafted with the neat certainty of conclusion. The maid, pale and trembling, languished in disgrace, though not yet in custody. The servants kept to whispers, treating her as though she already bore the mark of guilt. And yet Whimsy, drifting like a shadow through the house, remained unsatisfied. There was a flaw, somewhere deep, that no proclamation of victory could cover. It came to him first through a chance remark. Mrs. Vernon, her embroidery fallen to her lap, spoke wistfully one afternoon of Lady Halberton's youth. She had a strength then, she said, eyes clouded. People forget what she endured, what she overcame. Whimsy leaned in, coaxing gently. and learned that 30 years past, Lady Halberton's sister had vanished in scandal. The story was hardly spoken of now. But the sister, Clara, had been rumoured to have fled with a local tradesman, leaving disgrace behind her. Lady Halberton had never forgiven the betrayal, and her household had been shadowed by that shame ever since. A forgotten case, an old wound buried deep. Wimsey's mind pricked. He asked whether any trace of the tradesman's family remained. Mrs. Vernon shook her head vaguely. Perhaps a daughter, long since grown. The connection seemed tenuous, yet the word, daughter, rang in Wimsey's ears with peculiar resonance. He thought of the maid's frightened insistence that she had heard a child's laugh. He thought of the toy top, of its strange, oily smear. That evening, he descended to the servants' hall, feigning a careless interest in household gossip. It was there, among the rough laughter of the grooms and the clatter of dishes, that he overheard a name, Henslow. Mrs. Henslow, the housekeeper, had been in Lady Halberton's employ nearly 20 years. But before that, she had come from the very village where Clara had vanished with her lover. Wimsey let the name settle like a stone in still water. Later, in the silence of the library, he pieced it together. Mrs. Henslow was no stranger to the Halberton family. She was kin of Clara's disgraced line. Her presence in the house was no accident. She had stepped into Lady Halberton's service with quiet persistence, concealing her connection, biding her time. If revenge were her motive, then the staging of terror, the laughter, the prince, the toy, was no random artifice. It was a deliberate haunting meant to echo the past, to punish the lady who had cast her own sister into exile and shame. Wimsey returned to the gallery once more, his cane tapping against the hollow panel. He pressed harder this time, his fingers seeking. At last, with a soft click, a seam revealed itself, a narrow sliver in the wainscoting that yielded to pressure. The panel shifted, opening an inch to darkness beyond. A passage, cramped, secret, smelling of dust and oil. Here was the path by which laughter might be carried, by which prints might be staged, by which fear might creep unseen. He closed it again gently, careful not to draw notice. His lips curved in a faint smile, but his heart was heavy. This was no prank of servants. It was a vendetta carefully nursed, rooted in the bitterness of years gone by. And the scapegoating of the maid was not mere convenience but design. The true criminal had laid her trap too well, planting shoes to mislead, counting on Arbuthnot's eagerness to seize upon the first visible proof. Still, something more was needed, for motive alone could not convict. Wimsey sought in the solicitor's papers, poring over Lady Halberton's will. There it was, a clause striking Clara and all her descendants from any claim to inheritance. And there too, an alteration only weeks old, redirecting a portion of the estate to Mrs. Vernon. Lady Halberton had been revising her affairs, tidying loose ends. Was Mrs. Henslow aware of it? Did she fear discovery, dismissal, perhaps even exposure of her true identity? Piece by piece, the shadow of the past lengthened into the present. The footprints, the toy, the staged haunting, all became intelligible when viewed as the revenge of a family wronged. The laugh the maid had heard was no child's voice at all, but a cruel mimicry designed to strike fear in Lady Halberton's mind, echoing Clara's lost daughter, perhaps even Mrs. Henslow herself. That night, Wimsey sat in his chamber, the toy top spinning on his desk. He watched it wobble and fall, the paint chipped, the oily smear shining under lamplight. Shadows of the past. He murmured, here longer than we think. And sometimes they fall across more than one generation. He knew then that Arbuthnot's false victory had not only spared the true culprit, but emboldened her. Mrs. Henslow, secure in her mask of loyalty, would act again if pressed. The stage was set not only for the crime already committed, but for another. And unless he acted with precision, the hall would soon witness a second tragedy, one no less cunningly contrived than the first. Wimsey leaned back, fingers steepled. He would let the inspector bask in his triumph a little longer. For the real play had only just begun, and its script was written in old betrayal. Wimsey was not a man who relied on blunt accusation. The secret panel and the will had given him a theory, but it was too clean, too easily dismissed as conjecture. Mrs. Henslow had served Lady Halberton with impeccable devotion for 2 decades. To cast suspicion upon her without irrefutable proof would only make him seem fanciful. Arbuthnot, in particular, would laugh him out of the hall. What he needed was not another piece of evidence, but a crack in the mask. A moment when deception slipped, and the truth shone through. He found his inspiration in the toy top still resting on his desk. The thing was trivial, absurd even, but it held a weight disproportionate to its size. Its paint was chipped, its balance uneven, yet when spun it gave off that faint metallic hum, like a ghost of music. Wimsey smiled thinly. If the haunting had been contrived, then the props must hold a meaning known to their arranger. He would use the top to test that meaning. The next morning, while Arbuthnot busied himself with drafting the charge against the maid, Wimsey arranged a small gathering in the drawing-room. Lady Halberton was present, wan and pale, attended by Mrs. Vernon. A handful of servants were summoned under pretense of routine questioning, Mrs. Henslow among them, her face the picture of matronly composure. Wimsey chatted idly, playing the fool, until the atmosphere relaxed into a strange, quiet expectancy. Then, quite suddenly, he produced the toy top, set it spinning upon the polished table, and leaned back as it whirled. At first, the gesture drew puzzled looks. Lady Halberton gave a faint gasp, clutching at her handkerchief, while Mrs. Vernon bent forward in curiosity. Arbuthnot frowned, irritated at the waste of time. The servants exchanged glances, half nervous, half amused. But Wimsey did not explain. He simply watched the reactions. It was Mrs. Henslow who betrayed herself. For the briefest instant, her face tightened, not in surprise, but in recognition. Her eyes narrowed, then darted toward Lady Halberton with a flicker of something sharp, almost triumphant, before she smoothed her expression into calm disinterest. To anyone else it was nothing. To Wimsey it was everything. A moment too quick, too instinctive, to be rehearsed. The toy was no curiosity to her. It was a message, a symbol tied to old memory. Wimsey pressed the matter gently. "Curious, isn't it?" he said lightly. "How a child's plaything can unsettle a household. One might imagine it carries echoes of the past, forgotten corridors, vanished voices." He let the words linger, then glanced at Mrs. Henslow. Her hands, folded neatly, clenched imperceptibly. Arbuthnot scoffed. "A parlour trick, Wimsey. You've turned conjurer now." "Perhaps," Wimsey said airily. "Though conjuring, you know, is all about forcing the truth into the open. Watch the eyes, Inspector. They speak faster than the tongue." He spun the top again. Its hum filled the silence, hypnotic. Lady Halberton stared at it, as if it carried ghosts of her youth. Mrs. Vernon shook her head faintly, murmuring that it reminded her of old village fairs. But Mrs. Henslow kept her gaze fixed on the toy, her lips pressed thin, her composure strained. "Tell me," Wimsey said suddenly, fixing her with a bright, disarming smile. "Did you ever play with such things as a girl?" The question was innocent in tone, almost flippant. But it struck like a dart. For the first time Mrs. Henslow faltered, her voice catching before she answered. "No, my lord. Such trifles were not common in my household." It was a lie. Wimsey knew it by the tremor in her throat, by the way her hands sought the edge of her apron. The toy was familiar to her, too familiar to dismiss. He had drawn blood. When the gathering dispersed, Arbuthnot muttered that Whimsy had wasted an hour with his theatrics. But Whimsy smiled to himself. The trick had worked. He had not accused, not pressed. He had merely introduced the symbol of guilt into the room and let it do its work. The crack in Mrs. Henslow's armor was small, but it was enough. That evening, Whimsy went further. He sent for the maid, still distraught under suspicion, and asked her to describe again the laugh she had heard. This time he pressed her carefully. Did it resemble a child's laugh exactly? Or was it more like someone pretending at it? After much hesitation, the girl admitted that it had seemed forced, too shrill, like a woman mimicking youth. Whimsy felt the final knot tighten. Mrs. Henslow, then, had not only staged the prince but played the ghost herself, using the passage and the props of memory to torment Lady Halberton. He sealed his theory with one more unconventional test. Returning alone to the hidden passage, he left the toy top balanced on the ledge within, visible only to one who knew the way. The following morning it was gone. No servant would have thought to search there, no thief had reason to enter. It was Mrs. Henslow who had taken it, compelled by a mixture of fear and obsession, unable to leave the relic exposed. Whimsy held the missing top in silence, turning it over in his hand. He had her now, not by the heavy hand of evidence, but by the subtle betrayal of her own compulsion. The unconventional clue had revealed what the authorities could not see, that the crime at Halberton Hall was not the work of chance or malice in the present, but the echo of a bitterness festering for 30 years. And though Arbuthnot might still scoff, Whimsy knew the true hunt was nearly at its end. The toy top had been his triumph, the quiet proof that deception had cracked at last. He had locked it carefully in a drawer in his chambers at the inn, certain that its absence from the hidden passage marked Mrs. Henslow's guilty hand. It was more than a child's trinket now. It was a weapon, delicate and irreplaceable, carrying with it the weight of memory and motive. Yet when Whimsy returned from a late walk across the frosted grounds the following evening, humming tunelessly and ready to set pen to paper, he found the drawer forced and the top gone. The sight stopped him cold. The lock bore scratches, the wood splintered where a blade had been worked. The other contents of the drawer, letters, cufflinks, a half bottle of port, lay undisturbed. Only the top had been taken. Whimsy's first impulse was anger, a rare heat that made his hand tremble as he held the broken lock. Not the authorities, then not Arbuthnot's men with their clumsy paperwork. This had been swift, deliberate, precise. Whoever had taken it knew its importance. He sat heavily in his chair, staring at the empty space where it had lain. It was almost too perfect. The one object he could not replace, the one proof no one else had noticed, vanished in the night. He could hear Arbuthnot's voice already. "You see, Whimsy. Nothing left but your stories and tricks. We deal in facts, not fancies." But anger quickly gave way to something colder. Determination. If the evidence was gone, the theft itself became evidence. Someone had risked exposure, had crept into his quarters under cover of darkness, and had left all else untouched. That was as good as a signature. He went to the door and rapped sharply. The innkeeper, a nervous man with a lantern, appeared at once. Whimsy asked if anyone had been seen on the stairs, if any door had creaked in the night. The fellow shook his head, swearing that the evening had been quiet. Too quiet, Whimsy thought grimly. The thief had been careful. The next morning, Arbuthnot received the news with thinly veiled satisfaction. "You see what comes of keeping baubles instead of facts, Whimsy. If you'd turned it over to me at once, it might still be safe." Whimsy's reply was light, but the edge beneath it sharp. Safe, Inspector. I dare say safer in my drawer than in the hands of certain watchmen whose pockets are not above jingling with other men's purses. No, this was no petty theft. This was suppression. Someone is very much afraid of what that toy might tell us. Arbuthnot grunted and stalked away, but Lady Halberton, who had overheard, pressed Whimsy anxiously. Does this mean the trail is lost, Lord Peter? That there is nothing more to be done? On the contrary, Whimsy said, smiling to reassure her though his mind was racing. It means our quarry is desperate. Desperation, makes people sloppy. They will show themselves sooner than they intend. Yet in truth, the theft shook him. He had built his strategy on that one fragile link. Now, with the physical object gone, he was left with only observation, only the faint crack in Mrs. Henslow's mask. Could he make Arbuthnot, could he make anyone believe him on so slender a reed? That evening, he chose his next move carefully. He invited Mrs. Henslow once again into the drawing room under the pretense of discussing Lady Halberton's comfort. He made casual reference to the toy top, as though it were still in his possession. I have it quite safe now, he remarked, watching her face closely. Locked where no mischief can reach it. For the briefest instant, he thought he saw relief flicker in her eyes, as though she believed her midnight venture undiscovered. But then came a hesitation, a tightening of the lips, and she murmured that she could not imagine what importance a child's trifle could hold. It was enough. She believed it gone, yet feared it still. Which meant she had not acted alone. Someone else, then, had done the stealing. Someone to whom she was bound. Someone willing to soil their hands while she preserved her outward virtue. The web was tightening, but the center was still obscured. Later that night, Whimsy took a lantern and returned once more to the hidden passage. If the toy top was gone, perhaps something else had been overlooked. He ran his hand along the dusty stones, searching for prints, scraps, anything disturbed. And there, half hidden in the crevice where the ledge met the wall, he found the faint imprint of a boot heel. Smaller than a man's, narrower than Arbuthnot's heavy tread. A woman's shoe, then, or perhaps a youth's. The past was not finished with Halberton Hall. It clung like mildew to its stones, refusing to be scrubbed away. But even as he made this discovery, he felt the chill weight of danger settle upon him. The theft had raised the stakes. His unseen adversary was no longer content to unsettle Lady Halberton with ghostly laughter or half-glimpsed prints. They were watching him now, matching his every move, stripping away the tools he relied upon. Trust, once fragile, now seemed nearly broken. Could he confide in Lady Halberton without endangering her further? Could he rely on Arbuthnot, who dismissed his every theory as play? Or must he walk the path alone, hunted as well as hunter? As he snuffed the lantern and stood in the still, suffocating dark of the passage, Whimsy felt the answer in his bones. The real contest had begun. Evidence could vanish, props could be stolen. But fear left its mark upon every soul it touched. If he could no longer hold the toy top, he would hold instead the terror it had awakened. And terror, he knew, was the one thing even the cleverest criminal could never quite conceal. The night after his discovery in the passage, Whimsy found himself restless, pacing the creaking floorboards of his chamber long after the household had gone to bed. He replayed every detail in his mind, the vanished toy top, the boot print too slight for a man's heavy step, Mrs. Henslow's flicker of relief that had betrayed more than she intended. The threads were beginning to knot, but the pattern remained elusive, hidden by a hand too clever, or too desperate, to leave it in plain view. Yet just as he felt himself closing in, the case lurched violently into new and darker territory. It began with a scream, shrill, tearing. It ripped through the quiet of Halberton Hall shortly after midnight, sending Wimsey down the corridor in a rush, his dressing gown flaring behind him. The cry had come from the east wing, the disused rooms that Lady Halberton had long since abandoned. By the time he reached the landing, Arbuthnot and 2 constables were thundering up the stairs with lanterns. The source was soon found: the chamber, once belonging to Sir Henry's valet, now serving as a store for moth-eaten draperies and cracked furniture. Inside, sprawled grotesquely against a trunk, lay Thomas, the young footman who had carried trays with nervous precision during Wimsey's first nights at the Hall. His throat bore a livid mark, as though a hand, or a cord, had closed about it with ruthless force. His eyes, staring and glassy, needed no physician to declare the obvious. Arbuthnot cursed under his breath. "Another one," he muttered, kneeling to examine the body. "And under our very noses." But Wimsey stood still, every sense alert, searching not only the corpse, but the shadows that pressed around it. A second crime, so bold, so sudden, was no accident. It was a declaration. The thief of the toy top had struck again, silencing someone who perhaps knew too much or had seen too much. Lady Halberton arrived, pale and trembling, with Mrs. Henslow at her side. "Dear heaven," the widow gasped, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. "That poor boy." "Why him?" Wimsey glanced at her sharply. The question, uttered with genuine shock perhaps, nonetheless betrayed an assumption that the murder was not random but targeted. He tucked the observation away. Arbuthnot took command, barking orders to search the wing, to seal the doors, to question every servant. Yet Wimsey knew already that the killer was long gone. The hall, with its warren of hidden ways, provided too many exits. He crouched by the trunk, studying the dust about it. Once again faint impressions betrayed a smaller foot, lighter than any constable's. The same signature, written carelessly in haste. But it was Thomas's face that haunted him. The boy had been unremarkable, timid almost, hardly the sort to cross a dangerous adversary. Why him? Unless he had been the messenger, the errand runner, carrying some word or token that endangered his master. The servants saw more than they admitted. Thomas might have carried tea and letters in equal measure, and perhaps one letter too many had passed through his hands. The house sank into chaos. Fear, once a whisper, became a roar. Servants clustered in corners, whispering of a curse upon the Halbertons. Arbuthnot raged about incompetence, though it was his own men who had failed to guard the corridors. And Lady Halberton, wan and trembling, clung to Wimsey with desperate faith. "You must end this, Lord Peter," she begged. "Every day it grows worse. If even the servants are not safe, what will become of us?" Wimsey spoke gently, but his words carried steel. "What has become, my lady, is exactly what our adversary intends. Fear scatters truth like a flock of birds. But we must not let it drive us blind. We must watch more keenly than ever. For fear makes liars falter." That night he returned again to the passage, against Arbuthnot's protests. "You'll get yourself killed wandering these holes," the inspector snapped. "Quite possibly," Wimsey answered cheerfully. "But one can't catch a fish without a line, and this is where our fish swim." He carried only a lantern and his nerve, listening for the faintest stir in the walls. At one turn he paused, certain he heard the brush of fabric, the catch of breath, then silence. Whoever moved in those passages knew them better than he. Yet they had erred once, in leaving Thomas's body where it could be found. That was not caution but necessity. The boy had to be silenced quickly, and haste breeds mistakes. Returning to his chamber at last, Whimsy found an envelope pushed beneath the door. He lifted it carefully, noting the faint trace of damp earth upon the paper, as though it had been handled by someone not long from the passage. Inside was a single sheet, scrawled in a cramped, uneven hand. "Leave this place. The dead do not rest, and neither will you." No signature, no clue save the paper itself, rougher than any stock used by the household. It was a threat, yes, but also an admission. Whoever wrote it believed him dangerous enough to warrant warning, which meant he was closer than he had dared hope. Still, the second murder had changed everything. It was no longer a matter of uncovering old sins or tracing stolen toys. The villain was alive, cunning, and ruthless, willing to kill again without hesitation. The question was not only who had committed the crime of the past, but who might fall victim next. And Whimsy, staring at the crude message in his hand, knew with absolute clarity that the next strike might not fall upon some hapless servant. It might fall upon him. Whimsy sat at the small escritoire in his chamber, the ominous letter lying open beside him, its crude scrawl glaring in the lamplight like the sneer of a taunt. He had read it a dozen times, weighed its every word, but it was not the message itself that held his mind. Rather, it was the texture of the paper, the grit of soil upon its edges, and the faint trace of a scent, smoke, he thought, though not from wood or coal. Something sharper, acrid, almost metallic. He leaned back, eyes closed, letting the disparate fragments of the puzzle march across his memory in review. The vanished toy top, the hidden passage, the light step of someone smaller than a man, the servant Thomas cut down in haste, and now this crude warning. None of them explained the whole. Yet together they began to whisper at the shape of a design. The household remained in uproar below. Arbuthnot had stationed constables at every door, though Whimsy suspected it would do little good. Locks and keys meant nothing to one who knew the house from within, who moved through its secret veins like blood. The inspector had suggested searching the servants again, certain the villain must hide among them. But Whimsy shook his head. "Not hide, dear man," he had said. "Not hide at all. Move, flow, slip past as though unseen. That is the very trick of it." Arbuthnot grumbled, unwilling to yield, yet the words stayed with Whimsy. It was in that state of restless thought that an innocuous recollection struck him. Mrs. Henslow's offhand remark on the night of the first search. She had said, quite casually, that the toy top had always made a dreadful racket when spun across the tiled floor. "Like a child hammering on a tray," she'd said, with a little laugh. At the time it had seemed no more than idle chatter, but now the words returned with strange insistence. A top that rattled noisily, loud enough to be remarked upon, could hardly vanish without someone noticing its sound. Why had no one heard it, unless the person who took it knew precisely where and how to stifle it? He rose abruptly, the chair scraping against the boards, and went to his traveling case. From within he produced the few trifles he had collected: the scrap of paper, the cast of the small footprint, the sketches of the passage. He spread them before him like cards in a gambler's hand. The footprint. Yes, that was it. Too small for a man, too slight for Arbuthnot's burly constables, yet not so small as to be a child's. A woman's perhaps, or a youth's. But which woman? Lady Halberton, stately and frail, hardly the sort to creep through passageways. The maids were accounted for fearful and unskilled. But Mrs. Henslow, capable, brisk, moving about the house at will under the pretext of household duties. Yes, she fit the measure. And then the detail that clinched it. In her grief for her late husband, Mrs. Henslow had taken to burning little offerings, scraps of his letters, old keepsakes, in the small grate of her room. Whimsy had seen the ash himself. The smell he had caught on the warning letter, the sharp, acrid tang, was not of wood but of paper and ink charred in close confinement. He bent again to the sheet. The same hand that had consigned mementos to flame had handled this. But motive still eluded him. Why should Mrs. Henslow wish to threaten him? To silence Thomas, to meddle with the relics of the Halberton past. Unless her connection with the family ran deeper than her role as housekeeper's companion. He thought again of the toy top, and of the old tale of Sir Henry's vanished heir. A child's toy preserved long past its time, hidden rather than discarded. Could it be that the mystery of the present was bound to that ghost of the past, the lost boy whose absence had left the title and estates to others? His pulse quickened. The pattern began to gleam faintly in the fog. The theft of the toy was not mere mischief, it was erasure, the destruction of proof. Thomas's death was not vengeance, but prevention. Prevention of a truth being carried where it must not go. And the warning to him. Yes. That was desperation, the lash of one who saw the net tightening. Yet there was one more strand, and it came to him in the smallest of ways. As he paced the corridor, restless with his revelations, he passed the servants' hall, where two maids whispered together. "She's always humming," one said of Mrs. Henslow, "that little tune, the same one every morning when she lays out her mistress's tray. Humming." Whimsy stopped in his tracks. He remembered now, on the night of the first search, when the household was gathered in the library, a faint strain of humming had drifted from somewhere beyond the walls. At the time, dismissed as nerves, no one had marked it. But he remembered. And the tune, was it not the same rhythm, the same cadence, as the spinning toy's rattle? A nursery melody, perhaps, woven into her mind. A habit betraying a memory long concealed. Whimsy returned to his room, more certain with each step. The pattern was no longer scattered threads but the faint outline of a tapestry. Mrs. Henslow was at the center, not as a grieving hanger-on, but as one with knowledge of a hidden child, perhaps even a child of her own blood. The crimes of today were the echoes of that long, buried secret. Someone had returned, or was about to return, to claim what had once been denied. The top, the passages, the killings, all were in service of guarding that truth, or of seizing it. He sat once more at the escritoire, and allowed himself a thin smile. The adversary still moved in shadow, still struck unseen, but the shadows were thinning. A pattern had emerged, faint but undeniable, and Whimsy, with a hunter's patience, knew that once the pattern showed its edge, the whole would soon reveal itself. The next move would not be his adversary's alone. He was ready. Whimsy spent the greater part of the night in restless pacing, his mind knitting and unpicking the web of speculation until the threads lay taut and clear. He knew, now, where suspicion pointed. But suspicion was a fragile blade to brandish against the stubborn shields of loyalty and position. Arbuthnot would never be swayed by nursery tunes and humming, as he would bluntly put it, nor by Whimsy's finer sense for the unseen pattern. Harder proof was needed, or else the adversary would continue to slip like smoke through every grasp. When the grey of dawn seeped into the corridors of Halberton House, Whimsy was already seated in the breakfast room, his eyes on Mrs. Henslow as she moved silently about her duties. She was composed, perhaps a shade paler than usual, but unruffled. Her every gesture spoke of a servant's long habit of invisibility, and yet Whimsy, watching intently, caught the smallest betrayals. The stiffening of her hands when a constable entered, the faint hesitation before she poured tea. More telling still was the moment when a young footman carried in a toy from the nursery to amuse Lady Halberton's little niece, visiting with her mother. It was not a top, but a spinning rattle of brass. Mrs. Henslow's eyes followed it, hard and unblinking, until she realized Whimsy was observing her. Then she looked away, too quickly. It was enough to confirm his growing certainty. After the meal, he contrived to encounter her alone in the narrow passage that led to the housekeeper's room. "A word, Mrs. Henslow," he said lightly, though his eyes held hers. She paused, stiff as a post, but could not refuse. Inside her small chamber, Whimsy shut the door and took up his place beside the fire. The grate was clean, swept of ash, but the faint, acrid tang of burned paper lingered. He smiled. "You are a careful woman, Mrs. Henslow. Too careful, perhaps. You destroy what you fear may betray you, yet not all things burn to nothing. Memories cling like soot." She folded her hands, mask-like in composure. "I don't know what you mean, my lord." "Don't you? Then permit me to remind you. The toy top, spirited away, the secret passages, used with a practiced foot, the warning letter, written by one who reeked of burned paper and ink. You are not clumsy, Mrs. Henslow, nor careless. But grief makes us hasty, and desperation makes us bold." For a moment he thought she would brazen it through, but then something altered in her face. It was not fear that appeared, nor guilt, but a deep weariness, as though the long strain of years had borne her to the edge of collapse. She sank into a chair and covered her eyes with one hand. "You don't understand, Lord Whimsy," she said softly. "You cannot. It isn't theft, nor malice. It is blood." The words rang in him like a struck bell. He bent nearer. "Blood, you say?" "Yes." Her hand dropped, and her gaze fixed him with a sudden intensity, fierce, almost defiant. "Do you think me some scheming servant, after coin or station? No. I guard what is mine. I guard what was stolen from me long ago." And then, haltingly at first but with gathering force, the truth spilled forth. Years ago, when Lady Halberton's husband still lived, Mrs. Henslow had been more than a companion in the household. She had been, in secret, the mother of his second child, a child born in scandal and concealed lest the family name be dragged through mud. The boy had been spirited away, passed off as dead, but in truth raised in obscurity, watched over at a distance by the very woman now dismissed as a loyal retainer. The toy top had been his, kept as a relic of what she had lost. And now, as the years rolled on and the rightful heir had died without issue, the question of inheritance had risen like a spectre. If the truth of her son's existence were known, everything would change. But why murder? Whimsy asked quietly. Her face tightened. Because Thomas knew. He stumbled upon the passages where I hid him as a child. He guessed too much, pried too far. He would have carried it to Arbuthnot, to the courts. And my son would have been hunted like a beast for the crime of his birth. I could not allow it. Whimsy's blood ran cold at the calm in her tone. There was no gloating, no malice, only the iron conviction of a mother who would burn the world to shield her child. And the letter to me. The warning. To drive you back, before you dug too deep. You are clever, Lord Whimsy, too clever for my comfort. Better you feared for your skin and left us be. The depth of it stunned him. This was no sordid scheme for wealth, no grasping after titles. It was a twisted devotion, love warped into ruthlessness. The murders, the threats, the subterfuge, all sprang not from greed but from a desperate, furious will to protect her son's hidden claim. For a moment, Whimsy could not speak. He saw her not as a villainess, but as a woman long enslaved by a secret too great to bear, driven to choices that shrank her soul. The psychology of it was naked before him. She lived in two selves, the dutiful companion and the feral mother, always at war, always straining against discovery. You must know, he said at last. That this cannot hold. Blood may be hidden, but never erased. The truth will out, and what then? What will you say when the law comes knocking? Not only for you, but for the one you would protect. She stared at him, lips trembling, and for the first time the mask broke. He glimpsed fear there. Fear not for herself, but for the son who even now lingered somewhere in the shadows of Halberton House. She had guarded him with cunning and ferocity, but in exposing herself to whimsy, she had laid bare the core of her motive. The hidden motive was revealed at last, not in jewels or inheritances, but in the terrible, boundless power of maternal love gone astray. And whimsy. Though he felt the satisfaction of a hunter at last sighting his quarry, also felt the weight of pity, for here was a foe not entirely wicked, but broken by the cruel hand of circumstance. Yet pity or no, the truth was a blade, and once unsheathed, it could not be returned to scabbard. The final act was drawing near. The silence that followed Mrs. Henslow's confession stretched taut, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on her mantel. Whimsy let it linger, for silence often pricked more cruelly than words. She sat with her hands clenched in her lap, eyes fixed on the fire that no longer burned, her body rigid as if braced for the storm to come. At last he straightened and said with calm gravity, "You have given me the truth, madam, but confession alone is not redemption. The law does not deal kindly with hidden children, nor with women who kill to shield them. Still, you may spare him further ruin if you yield now." Her head snapped up, eyes flashing. "Yield? To you? To Arbuthnot's courts and their sneering lords who would brand him bastard and outlaw? No, Lord Whimsy. I would rather hang." He inclined his head, the faintest flicker of pity crossing his face. "And yet, Mrs. Henslow, the matter is not in your keeping. You have overlooked one small fact, that in seeking to frighten me off, you left a trail you did not intend. And I have followed it." Her breath caught, but she said nothing. Whimsy moved to the window, drawing aside the curtain with a casual hand. Outside, in the pale light of morning, stood Inspector Arbuthnot with 2 constables waiting for his signal. The color drained from Mrs. Henslow's face. "No," she whispered, rising unsteadily. "Not now. He must not know. He must never be dragged into this." "Then come quietly," Whimsy said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You may yet protect him with silence. Resist, and you doom him as well." For a heartbeat she seemed torn, but then a strange resolve settled over her, brittle and blazing. Without warning she darted past him, pulling open the narrow door that led into the servants' passage. Whimsy sprang after her, but she was already racing down the dim corridor, skirts flying, her breath echoing like sobs in the stone throat of the house. "Arbuthnot!" Whimsy shouted, his voice carrying through the open window. "Cut her off!" The pursuit that followed wound through the hidden guts of Halberton House. Staircases that twisted behind panelled walls, tunnels damp with disuse, the secret arteries through which Mrs. Henslow had moved unseen for years. She knew them better than any, but desperation drove her too fast, too reckless. Twice she stumbled, and twice she pressed on, her eyes fixed not on escape but on one final, unthinkable goal. Whimsy caught up with her at last in the old wine cellar, where moonlight fell through a grating above, striping the floor in silver bars. She had halted there, not from exhaustion, but to seize a bottle from the rack, smashing it against the stone wall until the jagged glass glittered in her hand. Her chest heaved, and her eyes shone with a wild, dangerous light. "Stand back, Lord Whimsy," she cried, her voice ragged. "You will not take me alive. If the law drags me in chains, then all is lost. Better one death now than the ruin of us both." Whimsy regarded her steadily, hands open at his sides. Violence will not save him. Do you not see? Every step you take down this path ties him tighter to your crimes. The boy's best hope, his only hope, is for you to bear this burden alone. She wavered, breath hitching. The glass trembled in her grip. For a moment it seemed she might strike, either at him or herself, but then Arbuthnot appeared at the far end of the cellar with his men, lanterns flaring. The light caught her face, and whatever defiance remained crumbled to ash. With a low cry, she dropped the broken glass and sank to her knees, her hands covering her face. "It is done," Whimsy said softly, stepping forward. He gestured for Arbuthnot to hold back, then bent to her level. "Mrs. Henslow, listen well. I have all the pieces, the toy top, the burned letters, the passages, the knowledge you tried so hard to bury. The case is complete. There is no escape. But you may yet choose dignity in surrender." Her hands fell away, revealing a face streaked with tears and dust. "You will never understand," she whispered. "You speak of law of dignity, but you do not know what it is to have your child torn from you, to live in shadows and lies for his sake. I would have killed 100 men to keep him safe. And that," Whimsy replied quietly, "is why you must be stopped. For love can be as destructive as hate when it loses all reason." She bowed her head, defeated at last. And when Arbuthnot stepped forward with the irons, she did not resist. Only one cry escaped her lips, raw and terrible, a name, her son's name, echoing through the cellar like a ghost's lament. As they led her away, Whimsy remained behind, staring at the broken glass glinting on the stones. The tension of the chase, the sharp peril of confrontation, ebbed into a deep, weary melancholy. He had won, yes, but victory sat heavy, for in Mrs. Henslow he had seen not merely a criminal unmasked, but a tragedy unveiled. A woman consumed by a secret that had twisted her life into ruin. The case was closed, the trap sprung, the villain unmasked. Yet even as Arbuthnot declared it a triumph of justice, Whimsy knew it was something darker. A tale of blood and silence, of love turned lethal, and of the terrible price paid when truth is buried too deep. The house was hushed after Mrs. Henslow's arrest, its long corridors echoing with a silence that felt heavier than sound. Whimsy lingered in the great hall, while Arbuthnot and his constables bundled their prisoner into the waiting carriage. The inspector's satisfaction was plain. Another case tidily resolved, another villain secured, but Whimsy did not share it. His eyes wandered to the blackened fireplace, the dust-coated portraits, the faint draught whispering through hidden cracks in the woodwork. There was a disquiet in him, like a violin string tuned too tight. He took out his cigarette case, tapped a cigarette against its lid, and then slid it back inside unopened. His fingers itched for clarity, not comfort. Something was wrong, not with Mrs. Henslow's confession. Every word of it rang true, steeped in desperation and bitter resolve. But with the case itself, a pattern he had thought whole now seemed to quiver, as though a single missing stitch threatened to unravel the whole embroidery. When Bunter appeared, immaculate even after the chase, Whimsy spoke in a low voice. "Did you notice it, Bunter?" "Indeed, my lord." Bunter replied calmly, though his eyes betrayed the flicker of unease. She claimed responsibility for everything, and yet, Whimsy finished for him. The timing fails. He strode into the library, where the evidence was spread upon the long oak table, the broken toy top, the scorched fragments of letters. The photographs Arbuthnot had dismissed as irrelevant. Leaning over them, Whimsy traced the sequence again. The first murder, the second, the vanishing evidence, all fit Mrs. Henslow's hand in some degree. But the letters, those letters written in a bold, masculine scrawl, had been the spur. The threat that drove her into desperate acts. Who had written them? Arbuthnot insisted they were old, that she had destroyed them in some fit of terror. But Whimsy's instinct rebelled. They were not old. One bore a watermark from a paper mill that had not existed 5 years ago. He lit a cigarette after all, inhaling deeply, then exhaled in a thin, thoughtful plume. "Bunter," he said slowly, "she has been made to carry not only her own burden, but another's." The thought lodged like a splinter. If Mrs. Henslow had been manipulated, pushed, cornered, maneuvered into her final desperate act, then the case was far from over. The true hand behind the curtain had yet to show itself. It was past midnight when Whimsy returned to his rooms at the inn, but sleep would not come. He paced, retraced, tested the logic again and again until the dawn crept pale across the rooftops. Then, like a knife through fog, it struck him. The letters had been delivered by hand. The servants swore no post had brought them. And one man, affable, ever present, had always been at the house when they arrived, Arbuthnot. The revelation was cold, almost clinical. A policeman with debts. Whispered rumors of gambling in unsavory clubs, the easy access to evidence. The vanishing documents, the stolen toy top, each could have passed through Arbuthnot's fingers under the cloak of authority. Mrs. Henslow had been guilty, yes, but guilty of one crime only. The rest, every careful twist of the knife, belonged to the man who now claimed triumph. Whimsy dressed with brisk precision, his mind sharpened by outrage and exhilaration. When Arbuthnot arrived later that morning, full of pomp to escort him back to London, Whimsy received him with courteous ease. They sat together in the parlour, tea steaming between them, the sunlight streaming in bright, pitiless beams. "A fine case, Lord Whimsy," Arbuthnot declared, neat as a pin. "They'll be singing your praises at the Yard for months to come." "Perhaps," Whimsy said mildly. He leaned back, cradling his teacup, his eyes never leaving the inspector's face. "Though I wonder, Arbuthnot, whether the Yard will be so admiring when they learn the neatness was rather too neat." Arbuthnot's smile faltered. "I don't follow." "Don't you?" Whimsy set the cup down with a soft click. "Let me refresh your memory. The letters that drove Mrs. Henslow to desperation, letters written on paper manufactured only 3 years ago. Yet she claimed the threats had haunted her for a decade. An inconsistency, wouldn't you say?" Arbuthnot's jaw tightened. "People lie. Criminals lie. She's hardly a reliable source." "Indeed," Whimsy agreed smoothly. "But paper does not lie, nor do watermarks. And as for the vanishing toy top, curious, was it not, how it disappeared from the evidence room only to reappear when most convenient? A conjuring trick. Arbuthnot, and you played it with a steady hand." The silence that followed was not the silence of the house, but of a trap snapping shut. Arbuthnot's face, usually so controlled, flickered with anger, then calculation. "You have no proof," he said finally, low and hard. "Proof enough," Whimsy replied. "Bunter has the receipts from your gaming clubs. He has the notes you borrowed against your own salary. You needed money, Arbuthnot, and you found a way to milk it from Mrs. Henslow's secret. Blackmail dressed as investigation. And when she faltered, you tightened the noose, pushing her into murder so that she might be the perfect scapegoat." Arbuthnot rose suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. His hand twitched toward his coat pocket. But Whimsy was already there, one hand firm on the inspector's wrist, the other plucking a small revolver free before Arbuthnot could act. "My dear fellow," Whimsy said almost gently, "do not add folly to villainy." Arbuthnot sagged back into the chair, the fight draining from him. His mask had shattered, revealing not authority but desperation. "It would have worked," he muttered bitterly. She was the perfect culprit. No one would have questioned it if you just walked away. Perhaps not, Whimsy said, pocketing the weapon. But I make it my business never to walk away when a single thread still dangles loose. That Arbuthnot is what undid you. You underestimated the pattern. When the constables, his own men, arrived at Whimsy's summons, their shock at binding their superior was palpable. Yet the evidence laid before them was damning, undeniable. By noon Arbuthnot was in custody, his protestations hollow, his once proud bearing shrunk to ruin. Whimsy watched as he was led away, the last shadow lifted from the case. Yet even in triumph he felt no joy. The last-minute twist had not exonerated Mrs. Henslow entirely, nor could it erase the deaths already written in blood. What it had done was reveal the darker truth, that corruption had stalked the very halls meant to guard justice, and that the cost of uncovering it was measured not only in guilt, but in broken lives. As evening fell, Whimsy stood at the inn window, gazing over the darkened fields. The case was closed, yes, but like so many before, it left its mark upon him. A reminder that in every pattern of crime, there was always another thread to be pulled, another hidden hand at work, and that sometimes the final revelation was the most poisonous of all. The trial of Inspector Arbuthnot was swift in its opening, but dragged under the weight of revelation. Whimsy, though reluctant to parade his deductions in a court of law, was summoned as the chief witness, his words the thread that bound the tangled tapestry into something coherent. The courtroom itself, with its pale oak benches and the faint smell of ink and dust, seemed to lean forward as he spoke, every pair of eyes fixed upon him. He told the tale in his measured way, of the forged letters, the conveniently misplaced toy top, the sequence of threats that had no origin outside Arbuthnot's own hand. The barristers bristled and parried, but every challenge struck the same stone wall. The evidence was irrefutable. The handwriting matched Arbuthnot's own under the microscope. The debts were undeniable, traced through club registers and promissory notes. The revolver, still bearing his fingerprints, had been concealed for no noble purpose. Piece by piece, the fire aid fell away until the man in the dock looked less like a policeman betrayed by chance, and more like a desperate schemer whose ambition had poisoned his oath. Yet Arbuthnot was not silent. He stood in his defense, shoulders squared, voice taut with scorn. Do you think me worse than the criminals I have spent my life pursuing? I did what the world has always done. I took what was within reach. If society turns its back, if it rewards mediocrity and starves its finest men, then who is to blame when one takes his due? The words rippled through the courtroom, unsettling, resonant with the bitter truth that corruption never springs in isolation. For a moment it seemed he had shifted the tide, that some jurors might pity the man who claimed he had been driven to villainy by the very system he served. But Whimsy cut the moment short with a simple reply. You mistake yourself, Arbuthnot, he said quietly, rising once more. You were never driven. You steered. Many men live with debts, with grievances, with injustice. Few choose to forge letters, to push a frightened woman into crime, to let blood stain the floor while they polish their medals. You were not a victim. You were the author. The gavel struck, the jury withdrew, and by the following day the verdict was rendered, guilty. Arbuthnot paled, but did not falter, his lips pressed thin, his eyes hard, as though he refused to grant his accusers the pleasure of seeing him break. He was sentenced to life's confinement, his rank and title stripped, his name already a byword whispered in shame. Justice, in the eyes of the law, had been served. And yet, as Whimsy walked from the court into the pale grey afternoon, he felt no triumph. Justice was never so clean, Mrs. Henslow remained in her cell, guilty still of the murder she had committed in her terror. The second victim could not be restored to life. The villagers, whose trust had been betrayed by the very hand meant to protect them, bore scars that would not fade with a judge's decree. Justice served. Yes, but never whole. Over dinner that night, Bunter observed his master's silence and at last ventured, "It troubles you, my lord, that Arbuthnot did not attempt to deny the deeper charge." Whimsy swirled the wine in his glass, the ruby liquid catching the candlelight. "It troubles me," he admitted, that his words contained a seed of truth. For all his villainy, he was not wrong in one regard. The world does starve its finest men, or at least those who believe themselves so. Ambition festers, debts weigh heavy, and temptation creeps in. Arbuthnot was clever, too clever for his post. Clever enough to think he might play both sides and keep his footing. What he forgot is that the smallest loose thread is always there to be pulled. Bunter inclined his head. "And you saw it, my lord, as you always do." Whimsy smiled faintly, though without mirth. "Yes. But I wonder, Bunter, whether I see them all, or whether, in another case, another Arbuthnot might slip past me while I congratulate myself on neatness." He pushed the thought aside, but it clung like ivy. To steady himself, he returned once more to the puzzle, as though recounting the logic might banish the shadows. It was the letters, Bunter. Always the letters. Everyone was content to accept Mrs. Henslow's tale of decade-old threats, but the paper told me otherwise. Paper, after all, has no sympathy for fear or memory. It only knows when it was made. Once I knew the letters were recent, the rest fell into place. Who had access? Who had motive? Who stood to gain? And the toy top, my lord. "Yes." Whimsy's eyes brightened with the sharp gleam of satisfaction. That was the stroke that clinched it. It vanished from evidence at just the right moment, then reappeared as though by magic when Arbuthnot needed to bolster his case against Mrs. Henslow. Too tidy, too rehearsed, villains are rarely neat, they thrive in chaos. But Arbuthnot, being a policeman, could not resist neatness. That, Bunter, betrayed him. The explanation soothed him, and yet the hollowness lingered. Justice, yes, but not finality. Arbuthnot might rot in prison. But the corruption he embodied, the temptation that had seduced him, remained loose in the world. And Mrs. Henslow's fate weighed heavily too. When Whimsy visited her cell the next morning, she received him with weary eyes, her once sharp features dulled by the grey of despair. "They have sentenced him," Whimsy told her. She gave a faint, bitter smile. "Then perhaps I am not the only soul ruined by this house. Yet I will hang Lord Whimsy, and he will live, even if behind walls. Tell me, where is the justice in that?" Whimsy had no answer. He bowed his head and left her to her silence, the question gnawing at him like an unhealed wound. When he departed the village at last, the fields stretched quiet and endless under the morning sun. The case was finished in the eyes of the law, the villain unmasked, the clues explained. But Whimsy knew the truth was never so neatly bound. Justice had been served, or had it? Arbuthnot lived, unbroken in his pride, perhaps even dreaming of some escape. Mrs. Henslow awaited the rope, her crime undeniable, but her guilt manipulated by a darker hand. And Whimsy, for all his triumph, carried the knowledge that he had merely cut away one weed from a garden where corruption grew unchecked. As the train bore him back to London, he closed his eyes and let the rhythm of the wheels soothe him. He had seen the pattern, unraveled the web, explained the hidden clues as only he could. That was his role, his gift, his curse. But he also knew the pattern never truly ended. Another thread, another knot, another Arbuthnot lay ahead. And when it came, he would be there to pull at it. one step ahead, though never quite far enough to banish the shadow of unfinished business. The train rattled steadily toward London, its rhythm a kind of anesthetic, lulling the mind into uneasy rest. Wimsey sat by the window, chin propped against his hand, his monocle abandoned in his pocket. The countryside streamed by in muted greens and browns, each field dissolving into the next, each hedgerow blending into the grey blur of morning mist. He had done what duty required, untangled the knot, revealed the villain, spoken his piece in the court. Arbuthnot was condemned, Mrs. Henslow awaited her grim end, and the case was closed in the eyes of the world. And yet, for Wimsey, closure remained elusive. It was not merely the echo of Mrs. Henslow's last words. "Tell me, where is the justice in that?" That haunted him, though they rang bitterly in his ears still. It was something smaller, almost absurdly so. A single scrap of paper he had come across in Arbuthnot's desk, brushed aside at the time in favor of weightier evidence. A torn half-page, containing only 3 words, scrawled hastily in a hand not Arbuthnot's. Next time. Southwold. At the time he had thought it a half-forgotten note, a triviality of correspondence misplaced among bills and reports. Yet now, with the case behind him and nothing to distract his eye, the memory of it returned, sharp as a pin. Why keep such a note? Arbuthnot had been meticulous, careful to destroy anything incriminating. Yet this scrap he had left tucked in the back of a drawer, neither destroyed nor concealed with care. Almost as though he had wanted it to be found. But not too soon. Wimsey frowned, his gaze drifting from the window to the train compartment opposite, where a young man in a bowler hat was reading his newspaper. The headlines concerned the trial, Arbuthnot's name splashed in bold print. But Wimsey's mind was elsewhere, on that single word Southwold. A quiet seaside town, unremarkable save for its pier and lighthouse. He could not recall Arbuthnot having any connection there, no relatives, no property, no cases that had required his attention in that region. So why the note? Why the promise of a next time? The thought needled him, relentless. Arbuthnot, for all his arrogance, had shown no sign of defeat. Even in sentencing, his gaze had carried a strange gleam, a pride untarnished by disgrace. Perhaps that was mere bravado. Or perhaps it was something more, the look of a man who knew his story was not yet finished. At King's Cross, Wimsey disembarked into the rush and rattle of the city. London pressed in upon him, suit streaked and clamorous, the kind of noise that drowned lesser men in its tide. He welcomed it, for a time, allowing the bustle to carry him home. Bunter awaited him with calm efficiency, whisking away coat and hat, setting a tray with coffee and sandwiches upon the table. The warmth of routine should have settled him, but still the word gnawed Southwold. After a silence broken only by the click of crockery, Wimsey spoke. "Bunter, do you recall, among Arbuthnot's papers, a torn note, scrawled, untidy, nothing official?" Bunter, who remembered as much as any filing clerk, nodded at once. "Indeed, my lord," a fragment reading. "Next time, Southwold. You instructed me to set it aside with the lesser miscellanies." "And where are those miscellanies now?" "Filed, my lord." "At your request, nothing has been discarded." Wimsey allowed himself a faint smile. "There are moments, Bunter, when your devotion borders on the miraculous. Bring it to me." Within minutes the slip of paper lay upon the blotter, its ragged edge a mute reproach. Wimsey examined it afresh under the lamp, tracing each hurried letter. The ink was ordinary, the hand unfamiliar, the paper cheap. Nothing to distinguish it save its words, and yet, he thought, there was something calculated in its vagueness. Next time what? Another crime. Another meeting. A rendezvous Arbuthnot never reached. The possibilities spiraled outward. What if Arbuthnot had not been the sole schemer in this affair? What if another hand unseen had guided or encouraged him? His motives had seemed selfish, personal, debts, ambition, pride. But what if those were only the visible branches of a deeper root? What if the case was not truly finished? Wimsey leaned back, staring at the ceiling where the lamplight cast faint, tremulous shadows. He had built the case on evidence, and the evidence condemned Arbuthnot alone. Yet evidence had a way of showing only what one was looking for. And Arbuthnot had been clever enough, perhaps, to take the blame for one part of a larger design. "Bunter," he said softly, "what do you make of Southwold?" "A fishing town on the Suffolk coast, my lord. A place for quiet retirement, not for intrigue." "Exactly," Wimsey murmured. And yet, Arbuthnot, or his correspondent, thought it important enough to mark as a next destination. Why? Bunter said nothing, for he knew when silence was required. Wimsey sat in the growing quiet, the slip of paper before him, the question widening like a crack in glass. Arbuthnot was in prison, securely confined. The case was over, and yet the telephone rang suddenly, sharp against the hush. Wimsey lifted the receiver, his voice crisp. A constable's tones came through, reporting routine matters from the village, except for one detail that froze Wimsey's hand midair. A visitor had been seen at the Gaul, a man of indeterminate description, who had asked after Arbuthnot but left no name. He had left nothing behind save a single card, blank but for 2 words hastily penciled: "Southwold waits." Wimsey replaced the receiver slowly, his heart quickening despite himself. So it was not a scrap, not a coincidence. There was another player in the shadows, still at large, still moving pieces upon the board. Arbuthnot had been but one piece, a pawn or perhaps a knight, sacrificed but not irrelevant. He rose, hands thrust deep in his pockets, pacing the room in quick strides. The satisfaction of justice served dissolved, replaced by the unmistakable thrill of pursuit renewed. The case, it seemed, was not finished after all, and as the clock struck midnight, Wimsey paused by the window, gazing out over the sleeping city. A mystery never ended, it only unraveled in chapters. Southwold was calling, and with it, another shadowed thread waiting to be pulled. He smiled faintly to himself, half with anticipation, half with wary resignation. For a detective, there was no final case, only the next,